Hello, everyone. We're here today to talk about navigating diversity, equity, and inclusion and how to make diversity work for CVCs. I'm Patty Burke, one of today's moderators. I'm a Silicon Valley veteran and have been in the VC, CVC, and startup world most of my career, both as a consultant and as an operating executive. I'm now a designer instructor for the GCV Institute, but I took a career detour several years ago to focus on women's leadership. I was at this for creative leadership at the time. And I was able there to design and teach a course for women in STEM. And I later wrote a book about their challenges called Beating the Odds, Success Strategies for Women in STEM. So women's leadership and DEI is very close to my heart. And I'm really excited about our panel today. And I'll go to the panel in a minute and let them introduce themselves. But we're excited to hear from them about the state of DEI in the VC and CVC world, and hopefully how to accelerate diversity. Before I do that, I'll first turn it over to my colleague Lee Sessions to provide some context for today's discussion. There's a lot going on in the world and in the industry, and Lee will set the stage for us. Lee?
Great, thank you, Patty. As Patty said, I'm with the GCV Institute. I'm our ecosystem development lead. We have hundreds of volunteers that help us out with all of our programs. We really are by CVC and for CVC, so that keeps us all busy. Fundamentally, the reason that we're talking about a lot of these diversity challenges that we're facing is the amount of money and the amount of investment that goes to female founders is hovering around 2%. It's much lower in Europe. And the amount of funding that goes to Black founders and in general, indigenous and other people of color remains very, very low. And so we're trying to impact these numbers. These numbers are primarily US numbers. We'll talk later, but a lot of the data that we have varies by country, and it's kind of difficult to pin down. So the two charts on the left here put this into perspective, primarily in the US. This is NVCA Deloitte data from 2023 that does show that female representation overall in venture firms has risen to 47%. But if you look at the investment professional numbers, that has also leaped up from 15% to 26%, and even higher gains at the junior levels, and a little bit less so in terms of the rate of improvement for investment partners or who are decision makers has moved up to 19%. So we're seeing progress. There's been a lot of focus on women over the years, and with dedicated progress, it's still below parity, but it's making some movement in the right direction, especially at the junior levels where the pipeline is starting to fill up. In terms of Black professionals, just to kind of highlight that, this number shows 5%. Other numbers like Black VC shows that it remains in around 3%. And this is just talking about employment in venture firms. When it comes to Europeans, the European VC data shows that 30% of investment committees are comprised of women and 12% belong to other minority groups. And again, in Europe, they might define the numbers differently. So if we compare that to our global GCV data that we have, what we see is that, first of all, though it's not a majority, 45% of global CVCs do include something related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in their strategic scorecards. Most of them that do report it, record or keep track of the gender balance and the team and ethnic racial balance. They report that about 45% of their teams are female, and then about half of their teams have some sort of a racial or ethnic mix. And again, outside of the US, these numbers get really challenging to count because people have different definitions and so on. The other thing that I think is interesting is that a number of now about 21% of the CVCs that track this data have data which shows the gender balance of their portfolio company CEOs or executives. And that's showing around, the vast majority being male, 83%, around 70 or fewer than 25% are male, or female, but about 17% are female. And then last but not least, the ethnic mix globally shows that about 49% have at least 26% that are somewhat diverse. But again, what we see is in the US, the numbers are much more tracked. 61% of US CVCs tend to track diversity, equity, and inclusion. The numbers are even higher in certain sectors like services and media and healthcare. And the larger CVC firms tend to track DEI related indicators. I just wanted to shine a spotlight on this because all of the studies say having objectives related to DEI makes a huge difference in the results that you get. And I'm sure you're going to hear about that from our panelists in a second here. So last but not least, as Patty alluded to, there is a lot of activity in this space. It's we are in the spotlight, we are in the news. There has been judicial and legislative activity as well as community activity, locally at the state level and the national level in the U.S. With court cases that have come up and struck down. A recent legislation about tracking of diversity numbers in California. And some interesting community activity where in Los Angeles and in New York, where industry groups, venture groups have committed and recommitted to making a difference in terms of helping to improve diverse representation. So very complex ecosystem that we work in. I'm sure we'll hear more about that and the implications of that from some of our panelists. So back to Patty.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we do have just an amazing panel here. I'm going to let them all introduce themselves, but you can see that we've got folks that have done a lot of work in this area and that continue to dig deeply into this area and are making some progress. As Lee told us, though, there's not nearly as much progress as we need. But let's hear from the panelists. Since you're up first on the pictures, Charles, can you introduce yourself and talk a bit about your initiatives in diversity, equity?
Sure. I'm Charles Hudson, founder and managing partner at Precursor Ventures. We are a pre-seed venture capital firm based in San Francisco. We've got about $200 million under management. We've invested in about 400 portfolio companies in the last 9 years. In addition to being a firm led by a person of color, our entire investment team is women and people of color. And about 50% of our portfolio companies have female founders, and about 25% of them have BIPOC founders. In addition to the work I do with Precursor, I am also on the board of Venture Forward, which is the National Venture Capital Association's nonprofit that has a pretty focused set of activities around diversity and inclusion. And I'm also on the board of VC Unleashed, which is a program that tries to help primarily graduate students break into venture capital, and they have a focus on helping women and people of color find new pathways into venture. So very involved in a number of initiatives and very, very thankful to be here.
Great. Thank you so much. And Charles has so much experience in getting these numbers up that we're anxious to hear more about how that's done. So let me go down and ask Trina to speak next. And Trina, if you could also just say a word about some of your investment outside of the U.S., because obviously Lee's numbers were mostly U.S. based. We'd like to get your perspective just in general. What is Intel Capital doing and what do you see outside of the U.S.? Trina?
Great. Thanks, Patty and Lee, for inviting me. It's great to be here. So Trina Van Pelt, I'm a senior managing director at Intel Capital. I lead our frontier investment domain, which focuses on paradigm shifting deep tech and some intelligent edge companies. I also chair our DE&I investment initiative. A little bit about Intel Capital. We pioneered in corporate investing over 30 years ago. We've put $20 billion to work, and as Patty mentioned, we're a global investor. So investing across the US, Western Europe, China, and Israel. We currently have, about 5 billion assets under management in about 250 companies. Of that, 20% of our portfolio is led by diverse founders. And that it equates to about over 850 million invested as well. The one thing about us, so we are a thesis-driven investor. So we focus first on our domains, frontier, like I mentioned, frontier, cloud, devices, and silicon. They all feed into the future of compute. We go up the chain a bit from Charles. We index towards more Series A and B, but lead over 75% of our deals. And so DE&I is something that we track as and measure how much we're investing, pushing our investors to expand their networks, but it starts from a core of being a thesis-driven, balance sheet investor that for Intel, kind of what is both financially motivated and strategically relevant.
Great. Thanks. That's great. We appreciate that, Trina. And Susan, how about you? You have really pioneering the path ahead in, with REI Co-op. Tell us more about what you are doing and how you got started.
Thank you, Patty. Yes, I'm Susan Viscon. I'm the Executive Director and Vice President of REI's Path Ahead Venture. And I had the opportunity to found and lead a $30 million fund and an accelerator organization, really with the goal of partnering and investing with founders of color in the outdoor space. So we have a really specific thesis. I want to go back to the importance of tracking what Lee shared. Really, our origin story originates from the fact that we realized that just 1% of founders in the outdoors, founders of outdoor businesses identified as a person of color, yet that did not match the 30% of those who recreate outside. And as we started to dig in there, we certainly saw what Lee shared on some of the sobering numbers, knowing that access to capital was one of the barriers for many founders. And so we set out to support with capital, but we also decided the importance of having programming for founder success, and that includes education, resources, and also grants for those that are early in their journey. So our fund is North America focused, and a majority of our investments are seed investments with an average check size around $250,000. We have some pre-seed and we have done some later stage, but that is the majority. And we launched actually 2 years ago this week. So we're still a very new fund and organization, but to date, we've completed 10 direct fund investments and 11 investments with our accelerators. So just over $4 million so far. I'm glad to be
That's
here
great,
speaking
Susan.
about this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You guys have really pioneered a lot of ways to attack this issue. So we really appreciate you being here. And last but not least, Sanjeev, at Avanta, you have also done some really unique programs, and looking forward to hearing more about what you're doing in this area. Sanjeev?
Morning. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Sanjeev Parikh. I manage Avanta Ventures, which is the corporate venture arm of CSA Insurance Group. We are now I founded it 6 years ago when I came here. Prior to that, I've managed the corporate venture activities of about a dozen Fortune 100 companies throughout my career. But at Avanta, we are a $300 million fund where we invest across seed, Series A, and Series B. Our typical check size is about $5 million or so. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
And what work have you guys been doing in the DEI area?
So
Sanjeev, talk a bit about that.
We started instituting, I think we were one of the few early investors where in all of our investment documents, we put in a DEI clause. We've been doing that for 6 years now. For all of our portfolio companies to have a DEI mandate and have those discussions at the board level. Because we lead rounds, we can actually dictate some of those things.
Okay, good. And later, let's talk about what some of your results have been, because I know you guys have some KPIs in that area also. Good. Okay, well, let's now go into some more questions. I'd like to first ask, let's see, I think I'm going to stop my share here so we can all see each other. There we go. That's better. First, let me go to Susan. And so can you tell us a little bit more about how you see CVCs defining DEI and what it entails and what the, what kind of the parameters are and why that matters?
Thanks, Patty. I really want to focus on why it matters. And one thing we talk about is it really makes good business sense, right? I had the opportunity in 2020 to read this book by Annie Jean-Baptiste. It's called Building for Everyone. And it's all about inclusive design. And it really helped shape my perspective on the importance of diverse voices at the table, that it actually leads to better innovation and it leads to better business decisions and, just the health. And so Annie speaks about a lot of examples in her book. One all of you are probably familiar with is the idea of the curb cut effect, when they changed sidewalks to include ramps for those people who were in wheelchairs, it actually opened up accessibility for a whole bunch of people, and we all use that now. She also talked about how the Google camera was improved to work on different skin tones, and that actually, made it a more effective and more inclusive product. So that is part of how we build on our work at Path Ahead, and we apply it with those that we work with. I have one founder that I've worked with, Gloria Hong. She is an Asian woman who has an incredible helmet company called Thousand. I bet many of you have used Thousand helmets. Well, she is building helmets, not just, people sometimes think about diversity and think about niche or building just for a community. And so I always try and balance that. People can find solutions that can be for a broad set of consumers too, so not to limit. And her helmet is a great example of somebody who's thinking about an urban environment versus what was happening in the cycle space before, where people were just thinking about road cyclists out there for their 50-mile ride on the weekend. And so she's really changed what is happening in that space and has grown a business to be really successful because there was a void of who was thinking about the urban cyclist out there. So to me, it's about good business sense.
That's great. So I really appreciate that. And I think there are statistics that show that companies that have diverse founders have, outsized returns. So that's great to hear. You have experience in this area also, Charles, in terms of the impact of diversity, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, we think about it at our firm through two dimensions. One is like who we choose to hire. Going back to the stats you showed, the venture industry is not terribly diverse on racial or gender dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been pretty intentional in trying to build an investment team that creates on-ramps and pathways into venture for people who don't normally get the opportunity. So, we've always had a majority, if not exclusively, female and mostly female women of color investment team. There's tons of investment talent out there in those communities. They just need the opportunity to demonstrate their skill and ability. So we've had no problem finding great candidates. We also run an internship program where we have year-round interns. I did the math. I think 50% of our interns have full-time jobs in venture capital. I'd like to think we had some small piece in helping them break in. I think the other thing is who you fund is a reflection of what you value. And so I've always told our limited partners, the people who've given us our capital, that I would never want to build a venture fund where I wasn't proud of our website and I wasn't proud of the faces of the founders that we backed, and where the picture wouldn't reflect our firm's values. So we don't have any specific quotas or numbers we're trying to hit. My general view is I started the firm because I thought people who didn't have relationships with VCs were kind of shut out of the industry. And I said, if we do our job right, our portfolio should just naturally look different, because the people, per the stats you showed, the people who are not getting access to capital are people of color and women. So if we're doing our job right, we will have a portfolio that's a blend. There will be plenty of like majority white male founders who we love working with too, but we should also have women and people of color well represented. And again, not just in the ranks of companies that we fund, but in our successful companies. And so about 40% of the top 5% of our companies are female founded and female led. So they're about half of our portfolio and they're about half of our top companies. And so we hold ourselves to a pretty high standard here in terms of making sure that we're looking at everyone. And I think probably the biggest improvement we've made that I'm proud of in the last 5 years is really the intersection of race and gender. I think at the beginning of of the firm's history, we did great on race, but probably not great at the intersection of race and gender. And it's been a focal point for us over the last 5 years to make sure that we're meeting particularly more female founders of color. And turns out when you meet more of them, you find more of them that you want to invest in and fund. And I'm pretty happy with
that's great.
the direction of that trend.
Yeah, you cut out a little bit on that, Charles, but I encourage everyone to take a look at Charles' website. Actually, all of the websites of the panelists here today, because you're going to see some real diversity in the portfolio companies, which is really exciting. But one of the things, obviously, that we hear is if it's not measured, it doesn't happen. And so we've got a challenge of how to measure successful diversity, equity, inclusion progress, and what KPIs to put forward, both for teams, as you say, if the team's not diverse, the likelihood of the portfolio sourcing is not going to be as diverse. So, what is happening in that area in terms of KPIs that matter? How are organizations being held accountable? Trina, can we get you to weigh in on that topic?
Sure. So, and I think for us, and I think for each firm, it may be kind of very individual in how you approach it. I mean, for us, we start with what is the core focus of the firm, and it connects to the strategy, because if you do that, it's sustainable, and it's sustainable beyond kind of who may be there at different times as employees may change. And then we also think about what can you control versus influence. And so we took an approach of we have 3 key areas. The first is looking at our own internal team, and continuing to expand diversity and diversity of experiences as well, because it drives differentiated networks that then can lead to differentiated types of deals in a broad kind of at even the pipeline of deal levels. We're seeing more, and we kind of push our teams as well to do that. The second is what direct investments that we can make. And this is where I mentioned we have 20% of our portfolio. We're proud of that, but we want to do better. And we track and measure that. But it's not just at the point of investment. It's also something that we think about how we expand diversity at the leadership stages over the life cycle of our investment. So it's pushing for at board levels, making sure that we're continuing to have a diverse slate of candidates there, management team levels. And we very much focus at the leadership level, because that sets the tone and culture for the overall firm and the company. And then the third area that we look at is we only make about 30 new investments per year. We put maybe 350 to 500 million to work. How do we extend on the ecosystem? And so that's an area where we also did a fund investment in Plexo Capital, which is a fund of funds, also makes direct investments, but they focus earlier, in the life cycle, more seed stage companies that can help feed not only pipeline for us, but all the venture capital firms who are looking to invest in Series A and B. So I think even as Charles was saying, getting more founders funded early on, and also having more diverse GPs out there who are funding, that helps build the pipeline for the Series A, B, and beyond. And then on a KPI level, we track it at an individual level as well as an org level. And it's something that we have to report on quarterly. So it pushes people to go, well, what have I been doing? Have I been seeking to kind of go diversify the networks and the different deals that we're seeing? And when we're all connecting that back into as a thesis-driven organization, it has ended up holding up very well.
That's great. So Trina, you have numbers that your investors need to meet, and are there dashboards where you're tracking that?
Yes, so we have a kind of individual level, kind of what are you doing to help manage, to help kind of drive diverse deals? Are you expanding, kind of finding opportunities, or are you continuing to bring the same things from your same networks? You're kind of working harder. Yeah. So that's at an individual level, kind of in your insights. And then at an organization level, we have direct numbers that we are tracking on a quarterly basis, an overall basis that we have to report up all the way through, that impacts, achievement on bonuses.
Okay, great. That's
Because like
great.
and that's, I think it's a point of what you choose to measure is the behavior that you drive. But it's where even kind of coming back to, we want to make sure that it is something that is sustainable. And then when it ties to the core, it's then, and we kind of digs into like another future question, but it then doesn't become a focus of cost cutting later on, right? Because it's a fundamental program. And again, back to where measuring the performance of the companies that we have in kind of diverse versus non-diverse by different sectors is another area that will then help drive to the point that I think Susan and Charles have also made, like it's better business decisions and better outcomes.
Right, yeah. Sanjeev, did you want to jump in on this and talk about some of the KPIs or ways that you guys are looking at it?
Sure. I mean, in addition to some of the things that Trina said, we take a very disciplined approach, as Trina was saying, in terms of the networks that you measure. We analyze a lot of data around who's funding who and the spaces that we care about. And are those firms and individuals relevant? So we have a whole DEI tracking mechanism that we employ and measure and monitor. They don't change as often as one would like. It's we don't go and look at it every day, but every 3 to 4 times a year, we're reevaluating our own networks. And again, it's measuring sourcing, which is the lifeblood of a venture fund in reality, right? So if you're not measuring where your deal flow is coming from, then you're not going to be able to go. And so then we become, and I think Charles touched on this, we become very intentional as a result of where we're spending our time, our energy, our resources, and our capital, not just our investment capital, but our marketing capital in terms of the sponsorships that we employ and so on. And part of that is, and I think Charles touched upon this a little bit, you have to be in the flow of that community. And so how are we entering into the flow of that community? Not to be transactional about it, but to show up each and every day over a long period of time so that we build trust within those communities.
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to get to Susan to comment on that, because you've been, a lot of folks that I talk to say it's hard to find these diverse founders, and you have been very successful, and you guys are talking about some ways to do that. Charles, like to have you talk about that too, but Susan, how are you sourcing, and how are you what's your research process to get to those founders? And also I'd like to have folks chime in with any questions that you have. Use the Q&A function.
Yeah, Patty, it's been an evolution. I would say, our first year, by just utilizing the platform that REI had to get the word out, we saw quite a few founders come in. Now that we're on our second and third year, we really started to use things like the outdoor recreation offices in every state who work with businesses. We're working with communities. At REI, we have quite a few communities that work on participation. So it might be Black Girls Do Bike or Latino Outdoors, working with those communities to get the word out about what we're doing so that their reach can also bring people in. So it's a balance of that. I really loved, though, the idea of like how are you in the flow and how are you actively seeking versus expecting people to come to you. And I will share a little bit. I'm new to venture, right? And when I first started doing interviews and starting my discovery process, I learned this term called warm introduction. And I'm like, what is a warm introduction? And you just realize that the network effect. And if you are not part of a specific network, your access is limited. And so we are always thinking about like how is REI, opening gates, creating warm introductions. We actually track how many introductions we make every month as one of our KPIs, because we're committed to making sure that we not only get you people within REI, but people in the broader industry and investment in, sourcing across the board. That's one of the things that we want to bring to the conversation.
That's great. Yeah, the concept of warm introduction is incredibly important, isn't it? So good. Charles, you are nodding there. What are you guys doing? Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, one of the big decisions we made early on was that we would actually build a team of people whose primary responsibility was to respond to people who applied cold through the website. Because not everybody will have the fortune of having a warm introduction to us. Of course, we love them when we get them, but we don't require them. And I just felt like if people don't feel like there's a legitimate way to be heard in front of us, we can't really say you don't need a warm introduction. So we have 2 interns and 1 full-time person, and their job is to make sure everybody who applies through the website hears back from us inside of 2 weeks. And last quarter, we got 1,200 cold submissions. And it goes up about 10% a month. And increasingly, those cold submissions are of pretty high quality. They didn't start out that way, but they're now of pretty high quality. And I feel like if you're going to tell people you don't need a warm introduction to get to you, you have to actually provide a channel that is in fact open.
That's great. And as you know, that is extremely unusual. So I'm sure you are pioneering in that way, and I hope others will set up something like that. That's fantastic. Good. So let's get on to some more of the pitfalls and the challenges. We have Lee talked about some of the regulatory issues, some of the legislation, judicial decisions, etc. I know you all have come, who knows how much that is impacting negatively or positively, but it will be very interesting to hear what your perspective is and what you're hearing about that. I mean, we often hear that during downturns and during, legislative uncertainty, that ends up putting kind of a damper on DEI. What's been your experience, Sanjeev? Have you encountered regulatory issues that you have had to deal with?
So around DEI, there haven't been any regulations until more recently. I think Lee touched upon this in his intro, in that California, I think, is the first in the state that'll start requiring reporting around DEI. I think it's coming to fruition, but we've not encountered regulatory content that has required the industry to move that forward. What we've done so far at Avanta has been because we have been interested in making sure we have that reach, and I think that's probably true of all of us. And we shouldn't be doing these things because we're forced to by our governments, right? It's the right thing to do. For all the variety of reasons that have already been mentioned. It drives greater value creation at the end of the day. And fundamentally, that's what we're all about. But those regulations are coming. And as a result, I think we do need to embrace them and be cognizant. Gets back to KPIs, gets back to measuring things, even things like intros. But I'll go to where Trina ended, I think, is it gets back into instituting for the portfolio companies the slate of candidates, and not just at the CEO level, but which is what we do. It's not, we don't just look at, like Trina, we don't look at the CEO level only. We look at sort of making sure that the portfolio companies and even ourselves are creating the right slates, a full diverse slate, so that all candidates and types are considered for the roles that are there. And then, hopefully they're choosing the best individual for a particular given role.
Yeah, good.
And so that will become part of the regulation of that.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Yeah. Actually, in terms of measurement of DEI, we have an interesting question here. I think, Trina, this would be good for you to answer. Do you think the person says, I really enjoy the discussion, so that's good. And then do you think the focus on and measurement of DEI is more advanced in the US than in Europe or Asia? Trina, I know you guys, Charles, do you want to comment on that? And I think, Trina, you have some experience there also.
Let Trina go first.
So I think the short answer is yes. It is more advanced. I think some of it is also the kind of the privacy laws, as well as kind of so what you're allowed to report and what you're allowed to request and ask. And it was also diverse communities are different in each country. So, you know, it is something that we track. And for us also, since we are part of a corporation, it starts with following our corporate definitions and policies and then kind of guides into what we can do. But the short answer is yes. You know, and particularly like, so is even as an example, like the LGBTQ community is one that is more measured within the US. It's much more difficult in other countries to do so. So I think that's kind of one of the overall distinctions. But that being said, it's something that we also do kind of track to see, you know, across our different geographies of investment. But I think overall within the US, it's easier to track you know, a range of diversity areas, and it is higher.
Great, good, interesting. And Charles, you want to add to that?
We offer every founder the ability to self-identify across a number of dimensions. It's part of our onboarding process, but we don't force anybody to fill out the form. So, and we don't force, none of the fields are required. If you don't want to self-identify as a member of the LGBTQIA community, you don't have to. If you're a person of color and you choose not to identify that way, you don't have to. It does help us understand who's in our portfolio. And the interesting thing is we started off with very coarse categories. I just looked at it. We now have like 24 different categories for race and ethnicity. We started off with just, for example, we started off with just like Black. Then we had people like, well, I'm like African. Then we had Caribbean. Then we had, I'm actually West. So like over time, like we've gotten more fine-grained because the people in our portfolio have told us that like this is something that is important to them. And interestingly, the fastest growing category in our portfolio is biracial or multiracial.
Interesting.
And, yeah. And so like every year we go back and look at the categories and say like, are these right? And most of the changes we make come from someone who looks at the form and says like, I don't see myself on this form. And so can you please add me and how I see myself to this form? And it's been very illuminating. But I'd also say that like we certainly see that like the data skews towards the people from groups that have been historically excluded are the ones that are the fastest to self-identify. So our data, we do a little bit of correction on the back end, because otherwise I think certain groups would be overrepresented based on self-reported data.
Patty, I'd love to add on
please
that.
do, Susan.
So we also do the self-identification, but what was really helpful as we went through this process is also asking them whether that is information they want shared externally or only internally. And so whenever we create any content around marketing or sharing, we always want to make sure that that founder wants to be identified in that way. So I think that's really important too, as you think about any marketing materials you might make or any external facing content.
Okay, really good, important. Yeah. So we've talked about some of the positive things that you all are doing and what you're able to accomplish. What kind of threats have you had to your programs, and particularly from a corporate perspective, to sustainability? I mean, we know that, you know, and there are downturns, people are looking for things to cut. Have you seen discussions of you being on the cutting block, on the chopping block, or, you know, what other types of threats have you seen? And do you want to start with that one, Sanjeev? Any particular threats?
I mean, from a DEI perspective, I don't know that we've had any threats,
Mhm.
if that's what you mean. Look, as a CVC, you're constantly existential, right?
Fact of life, eh? Yeah.
Value.
Mhm.
And actually, by as a VC, if you're not generating value in
Well,
return,
we've seen that, of course, yeah.
you're not going to
Yeah.
raise a next fund, or you're not even going to be allowed to continue investing your fund.
Mhm.
So that's a constant, I
Mhm.
think, but that's not related to DEI in any
Okay.
way.
Yeah, any other, Susan, you want to jump in? Any other market conditions or issues that impact sustainability?
I think one thing just for us to talk about is certainly in 2020, many organizations were making commitments around DEI, and we have more recently heard criticism of large organizations that have said they're going to do something and they haven't progressed it. So I think it is important to understand kind of the landscape. For ourselves, we have been committed to racial equity, diversity, inclusion, and really focused on it for the long term. Because we're a co-op, we get the opportunity to continually consider that. Also, when we built this fund, it went to the board. It has a separate entity. It is committed for through 2030. And so we tried to make sure that we set it up as something that was really part of the overall company, and that it wasn't tied to a specific CEO or a leader, but that we thought about like, how does this exist for the long range too?
That's great. That's great. Yeah. And Trina, from your perspective, anything that has happened over the life, long time that you guys have been investing in with this focus on diversity, any challenges that have come up?
To be honest, no, because we just have, I think, overall very high level corporate and leadership support to it, because again, back to my point at the beginning, like everything we're doing is connected to the core of how we invest. And I think also like it's very capitalistic, right? Like we're looking for great returns. We want the best kind of market growth opportunities, the best new products and technologies with the best management teams. And then if we stay true to that, then we should be driving the overall returns. So it's something where we haven't seen that. I think it is, though, there are risks, right? There's risks at the macro level with the overall market situation, and with interest rates and what may be happening, and like may take time to kind of trickle through, but I expect there's going to be continued cost cutting. And so if you have programs that are not kind of core and fundamental to the long-term operations, those are potentially at risk. So I think that's something for the audience to be thinking about, how to make sure you're connecting it to something that is very core to survive it. And I think that can possibly also drive into where we may see a longer term effect of like where there may be, if some of those corporations have put money into other fund managers, and then if they don't follow through on the next the next fundraise, that where there could be some challenges. But overall, I think that and again, even back to one of the comments of, it's unfortunate that there has to be some legislation, but hopefully there will be some positivity that comes out of requiring some compliance and reporting. The devil is always in the details of like how well they can construct reporting there, but I think over time we'll get that figured out.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. And we talked about this in an earlier call that, particularly after the death of George Floyd, there were so many programs that were put in place, and how many of those still exist, and how many people were held accountable for that. So, Charles, have you seen?
That's the challenge, right? When there could be people are getting credit for the PR that they put out, but then there's no requirement to follow up and report on what they did. And I think that's where I think there might be a little bit, this will help kind of shine a little bit more light on that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. So where are we going in the future? Okay, you guys have programs, you have a window and a view onto the VC and the CVC industry. What do you think needs to happen? Because the numbers, as Lee showed, slight increases. I mean, you all have impressive increases and are getting impressive numbers, but still, I'm sure not where you want to be. But where can we go in the future? I mean, Sanjeev, do you want to thoughts on the future of
Yeah,
CVC and DEI?
to your point, Patty, there's a lot of work still to be done, right? The progress has not been nearly as impactful as it needs to be. And I think we're just beginning when we talk about measurements and some of those things. I mean, let's be honest, they don't really have any teeth today. And we measure some of these things for ourselves. We don't report them publicly, but when we do, it's we talked about how we institute and ask our portfolio companies to have diverse slates of candidates for all of the open slots that they do have. But is there any recourse or repercussions, rather, if they don't do that? There aren't today. And so I think in the future, we're going to need to see some teeth to these initiatives that we all want. And because the numbers are woefully underrepresented.
Yeah, absolutely true. So Charles, any thoughts for the future? Any, breakthrough ideas, and from anyone, any breakthrough ideas on what we can do about this challenge?
I really do think it's really, this might sound really obvious. I really do think on the venture side, it's important to get money into the hands of people who are actually making a difference. I think we have enough observable data at this point about which firms are actually putting money to work in the communities that we're interested in, and which firms are talking about it. And I still see a disconnect on the capital allocator side between where the money goes and who's actually having impact. And I find it actually quite perplexing that people continue to give money to firms that say they're going to do one thing and do quite the opposite. So for my little corner in venture, I really hope that many of the firms that are actually making a difference and making sure that this money gets to their intended audiences get more access to capital, and that the people who, to Sanjeev's point, the people who claim to have an interest in doing this are held accountable for the results, and that at some point that money gets to its intended audiences.
That's great. So transparency and accountability. I think that's very interesting. And one thing that GCV is doing in its upcoming survey is we do have questions on DEI and related programs, founders, etc. So as we get that next survey out and get that data, it'll be interesting to see who's really doing what and who, is accountable. So we'll be sharing that. So thoughts from the rest of you, Susan? Where's the future?
Yeah, Patty, I was just thinking of something to share with this group, because it might not apply, but I think there could be some application. At REI, one thing we do, it was part of our sustainability work, is we issue product impact standards, and all 1,000 of our brands and vendors who work with us have to comply to it. What we did 4 years ago is we actually extended past sustainability to include inclusion. And so the idea is that we actually ask that our vendors, one, they make sure that they have diversity in representation in their marketing, that they're not doing any cultural appropriation on designs or naming of products, and that when they're creating products, they're thinking about all skin tones and all hair textures. And so I think, thinking about the way that you have impact and influence, and is there policies or standards or guidelines that you can begin to push out with the partners that you work with that could change the industry, right? We like to think at REI, we're an influencer. We can have outsized impact when we really use that broader network. So that's food for thought.
I think that's great food for thought. And you all are all influencers. And I think they, the work that you've done, that the more that you can use that as influence in the industry, the better. Any last words on that in terms of where we're going for the future? We got another couple of minutes before we need to wrap up. Sanjeev?
No, I mean, look, everybody said that you said transparency, accountability, and I think, as Charles said, getting money into the hands, but it will be, why does venture exist, right? If you go back, it's not, let's be honest, it is not to do DEI. It is, as Trina said, we are here to drive growth for those that give us the capital. In our case, it happens to be corporations. So we have to drive growth for our corporations. We're using diversity, equity, and inclusion because, to where you started, where Lee started with his commentary, we've seen the data supports that by having diversity, equity, and inclusion founders and teams, you can actually do better in terms of return. So that's why DEI matters at the end of the day. So as long as we can keep tying those things together, we'll continue to have capital to invest. But make no mistake, I'm not here saying that we're a DEI firm and that's all we do. We're here to drive returns and value for our corporate parent.
Right.
Maybe just one other thing to add, I think
Yes.
it's just really important to, measure and then figure out where you can evolve. And even in an area where one of the things that Intel Capital is trying to do for a kind of value beyond capital is we have like an embedded expert program where we have individuals, we know what some projects are that some of our portfolio companies need, and we find people within Intel to help do that for free for the company. And there's a balance there of also trying to get a little bit more like kind of venture type early stage, scrappiness back into some of our kind of other big parts of big Intel. But what's been interesting is something that we've been doing, and we were looking at the numbers going, over 50 to even 60% of the experts who are getting placed in our portfolio companies are diverse. And some of that's been through self-selection of like, hey, like I want to go do this and be in seeking to be engaged. But I think it's also then for portfolio companies who may not be as diverse, like they're getting diverse candidates coming in, and even that can be opening up their aperture as well, and kind of learning. And so it's an area where you get something. It's fairly new for us, but like when we're looking at the measure, we're going, this is fascinating. And even if we think about it at an Intel level, where maybe only in some particular areas, maybe only 10 or 20% of the employees are diverse, but yet 50% are going to help portfolio companies. I think this is can help create some sort of flywheel that we can end up seeing, even just more benefits. The difficult thing is those are also so hard to measure and track. But I think the point is you're just continuing to have different experiences that can help, grow and expand.
That's great. And that actually is a new idea that could be put into play that a lot of CVCs don't do. So that's something that we will note in our wrap up. We'll do, a wrap up on this and pull out the key takeaways. And I think we've had a lot of good input on this. Any final words before I turn it back to Lee for the closing? I think we're just about out of time. But any last words of wisdom? We are open to have another comment or two. Okay, I think we've tapped into your brains as much as we can. So let me turn it, but we really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. I know that the audience and the long tail audience that downloads these things in the future really appreciate this. So let me turn it back over to Lee to wrap it up. And then
big hat off. Thanks to all the panelists. I was biting my tongue not to jump in on some of the things that you said. So many wonderful ideas to share, and we really appreciate it because this is an ongoing challenge, and we're making a difference with it. So back to the data, I have to go there next and say we are in the midst of the GCV annual survey refresh, And this is the source of a lot of our data. So I would encourage all of our audience to take a few minutes, go in and complete the survey if you've not already, because this is kind of the lifeblood of a lot of our work. If we don't understand our baseline, we can't improve it. So good comment on that. The link is there and on the GCV website. And I want to go on next. There's some upcoming events to make you aware of. We have GCV Asia going on this week, actually, and next week. A GCV Connect event in Germany, the GCVI Summit in Monterey next spring, and of course the annual symposium in the UK next June. And the Institute, as we mentioned, is kind of ongoing. And I mentioned our experts participate in every course that we have. We appreciate all of the volunteer experts who serve as guest experts in our courses. We've got an upcoming class that I'm really excited about. Well, next week we have one that's kind of a focus on Latin America. And then in early December, we have a spotlight on female leaders. And a lot of the experts that we have in the course, actually the majority of the experts will be female. So really excited about that. And of course, we have our Landing the Value of Corporate Venturing, which is really talking about how you really deliver on the promise of the investments that you've made to add value back to your corporation, as well as the portfolio companies. So lots of great courses that we have to offer, and feel free to get in touch with any of us. We're on LinkedIn. Our contacts and information are available on the GCV website for Patty and I and others in GCV. The organization serves to support our CVCs, and that's why we're here. We appreciate the openness of our community. This webinar series has been really very, very thoughtful over the last year and a half since we've started it. The next topic in December is really going to be hot. It's about fusion. So encourage folks to sign up for that. So with no further ado, thank you all for your time and attention. We appreciate the panelists. We appreciate the participants, and we'll see you at a future event.
Thanks so much to everyone.